All right, welcome everybody to the final of our spring webinar series, Rock It, Don't Knock It, Become a Third Grade MVP. I'm your host, Dave Johnson, Chair of the Webinar Committee and incoming President-elect for the Michigan Council for Social Studies. We're excited to have you here at our inaugural webinar series. MCSS is excited to offer this first round as free for members and non. We are a content organization that serves hundreds of teachers across the state at the elementary, middle, and high school level. We have strong partnerships with universities, ISDs, and other social studies related professional organizations around the state. We encourage you to visit our website, www.mcssmi.org, and click on the Join Us button. Your $40 a year membership gets you a discounted rate to our annual statewide conference, and next school year, access to more webinars like these, as well as other amazing resources like our biannual Journal Plus, partner offerings, and some cool sketch-based training opportunities that we'll talk about at the end here. MCSS would also like to thank all of our partners in helping us get this series going. We had a few weeks ago the Genocide Education Project. 2 weeks ago we had the Michigan Geographic Alliance. Both of these groups represent content-based organizations at the state and national levels that have worked with us on a variety of levels for several years. The Northern Michigan Learning Consortium is a collection of 10 ISDs in Northern Michigan, and the Iowa Area Intermediate School District is an ISD that services a large geographic region of West Michigan. All of these partners have provided us with the learning opportunities that we'll be exploring this spring, or that we have been exploring this spring. A couple of quick ground rules before we begin. If you've not already done so, take a minute to mute your microphones while our speakers are talking. Even if you aren't talking, paper shuffling on a desk, opening and closing drawers, doors, all of that can affect the sound for everyone else. And if you have a question for the presenters at any point in time, please throw them into the chat box. If there's time in line during a presentation, we'll ask, otherwise we'll save them for the Q&A. In just a minute, I'll be introducing our presenters, but this was our full slate of series for this spring. It came together as our COVID Learning Commission here got together and reached out and called in some favors and asked some people to come and share their expertise with our members this spring. All of the videos are available archived at www.mcssmi.org and at www.misocialstudies.org. And that second one is a further collaborative of all the various content and professional organizations from around the state. And this presentation is called Rock It, Don't Knock It, Become a Third Grade MVP. This is set up as a panel discussion tonight, so we have some impressive biographies here, starting with our moderator tonight, Scott Roberts, Associate Professor of Social Studies Education at Central Michigan University in Mount Pleasant, Michigan. Scott teaches courses in elementary social studies ed, current educational issues, and research methods. He's served as a board member of the Michigan Council for Social Studies, on several committees for the National Council for Social Studies, on the editorial board of Social Studies in the Young Learner, and was named the Georgia Council for Social Studies Gwen Hutchinson Outstanding Social Studies Educator in 2012. He was a former middle school teacher and received his doctorate from the University of Georgia in Social Studies Education in 2009. He's the author of multiple publications concerning history education and is co-editor of the recent book, Hollywood or History, an inquiry-based strategy for using film to teach United States history, published in 2018. He's also the co-editor of the National Council for History Education's History Matters e-journal. His research interests include state history, discussion-based strategies, history education, and educational technology. And joining him tonight is also Joy Queer, who is a third grade teacher in Holland Public Schools, where she has taught for the last 23 plus years, but you wouldn't know it to look at that youthful picture. She is the chair of the National Geographic Bee in her area, and she was Teacher of the Year for Holland Public Schools in 2019. In addition to teaching third grade and all of those other cool credentials, she's also an author of one of the Michigan Open Book Project books, the third grade Michigan Studies book. And she's been a writer for the accompanying Giants curriculum units that go along with those, and is a member of the MCSS Board of Directors. We also have Dr. Matthew Daley, Associate Professor of History at Grand Valley State University in Allendale, Michigan, where he teaches Michigan, Great Lakes, Urban, and Public History. He works with a variety of community historical groups throughout West Michigan and has contributed to museum exhibits throughout the Great Lakes region and serves on the board of both the Grand Rapids Historical Society and Grand Rapids Historical Commission. His scholarly and popular publications have appeared in publications including the Michigan Historical Review, Minnesota History, the Wisconsin Magazine of History, and the Northern Mariner. And then last but not least, a very good friend of many educators in Michigan, Dr. Phil Geschmel is a research associate with the Michigan Geographic Alliance. He has degrees from Concordia Teachers College and the University of Georgia. He taught at the University of Minnesota, designed animated maps for television, and was principal investigator for the AAG Argus and ARG World projects, and is the author of Language of Maps through National Council for Geographic Ed and Teaching Geography from Guilford Press. Currently, he's working with 3rd and 5th grade teachers to design educational materials. I want to welcome all of you here as I stop sharing my screen and turn things over to our moderator for this evening, Dr. Scott Roberts. Scott, take it away.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I am going to try to share my screen. We'll see how that goes. I think I have my piece right here, the share. All right. So let me turn on the slideshow and we'll get started. I think Dave is going to edit this out for the recording, but for y'all who are with us, sorry about hearing all my voiceovers as I do what I'm supposed to do. All right, and I stole some of Dave's thunder. There's us again. By the way, called Corona, my hair is grayer and longer. Sorry about that. All right, I think we're good. All right, everyone. So again, thank you so much for joining us. As a former state studies teacher myself, where I taught 8th grade Georgia studies my entire teaching career, I am very excited to serve as the moderator for this webinar. A lot of my research has been about effective teaching of state history, as well as the content found in both the standards and the curriculum in several states in the United States, including Michigan. I have found that on a national level, state-focused social studies has both promises and problems. The teaching of 3rd grade Michigan studies is no different. There are some really good things about Michigan studies. The state standards are open-ended, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. And you have great resources like all the ones that Dave mentioned. The Michigan Open Book Project, which I share with my students every year, the Michigan Geographic Alliance, Giants, and MCSS. We really give you a chance to work with those in social studies ed, to learn from experts in the field, and really try to give you some good information that you can bring to your classroom. Michigan standards themselves are pretty well balanced in terms of the disciplines, where you have history, geography, economics, and government all kind of equally given to your students. The standards also allow for some inquiry-based activities based on the NCSS C3 inquiry-based framework. And I know that there's been some webinars about that as well. So hopefully y'all are able to watch those down the road, or you attended in prior meetings. However, those sets of standards are perfect, and there was certainly some controversy when it came to all of Michigan's social studies standards a few years ago. With the 3rd grade standards in particular, I think that sometimes being open-ended is a blessing and a curse, because it can cause some difficulties for a 3rd grade teacher to determine what to teach. And there's so much to know when you have open-ended standards. In addition, there's a lot of content standards that are expected for your students are expected to learn. So a lot of things your 3rd graders are supposed to learn when you read over the standards. In some cases, as I just found out some work I'm doing, some of the standards were written at a very high level. One Michigan standard had a reading level of 22, whatever that means. So I'm assuming graduate level. So some of the standards are very, very wordy and may be difficult for a 3rd grader to understand. Finally, there is a lack of resources for teachers based on some of the requirements for the standards. So the purpose for this webinar is to offer a panel discussion that will help you become a MVP of 3rd grade Michigan studies. Our goal is to help you with both geography and history, and to provide you with some great lesson ideas and resources that you can use in your classes. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. So when you take a look at the PowerPoint here, the only thing I've done in this PowerPoint primarily is just offered you the standards to view, because our panelists will actually discuss these standards as we go. So I'll try to remember to click my slides to show you these standards as we discuss them. I know Phil and Joy also have a great PowerPoint they're going to show you. So there will be some switch over to get to theirs and a few questions once we get to questions number 2 and 3. So we do have some time before we get to Phil and Joy, but again, these standards are there just for you to take a look at as our panelists do answer these questions and tell you more about each of these standards. So we'll start off with Matthew. So some of the early standards in 3rd grade, as you can see, are listed. So one of them is identify questions historians ask in examining the past in Michigan. And the other is explain how historians use primary and secondary sources to answer questions about the past. So would you mind sharing what kind of questions that you ask when you study Michigan's past? And also, can you explain what primary and secondary sources are and how you use primary and secondary sources in your own work?
All right, well, thank you. And I wanted to just, I won't control the PowerPoint, but certainly I included a number of ideas and resources further down in the PowerPoint. And those are really what was my effort to try to engage this. I work heavily with social studies students at Grand Valley. And so these sorts of standard questions have been something that I've sort of dealt with for some time, and also to have my students to sort of engage this piece, and we try to build it into class. So when we think about examining the past in Michigan, one of the sort of major ones is to say, well, who lived here in the state, right? So what was, if we think of it up to statehood, who were the peoples and communities that lived in Michigan? And so and that of course is Native peoples, and to be able to examine what their lives were like. What is the sort of the archaeological, what are some of those materials that can be found to really sort of say, who are these communities? Another component would be to also think about the environment. How does that influence both Native peoples and also European settlers who are going to be coming to here, and also to sort of what is driving European explorers to come here, and that sort of component. I always kind of joke to folks that the French came to Michigan. They left lots of great names. We delightfully massacre their pronunciation, but of course, it's very nice that they did that. But it also raises a lot of questions, like why would people come here? What are those sorts of pieces? One of the challenges that my students always face at the college level is it oftentimes seems like an unbroken march to get here. And so for students, I ask is to think about the context. What is the context driving communities to come here? Why do they interact with each other as they do? What are spaces and sort of locations that can be still found? Things such as the Sanilac petroglyphs over in Sanilac County in the Thumb, ancient people's sort of pictograms and descriptions that are on rocks and so forth. A very ancient historical document, narrative, physical touchstone. Another piece that we would ask is so how do groups interact with each other? So how did Native peoples and early Europeans, the French, the British, how did they interact with each other? What were their motivations for those sort of interactions? What is the dynamic for how they got along with each other, right? What did they want from each other? And that can be a real challenge, because what we get, and this sort of spills over a little bit into standard 2, is really what we define as primary sources. When you deal with things such as Father Hennepin, who was an early French Recollect priest who comes to the Great Lakes and sails on the famous ship, the Griffin, which made one voyage and then sank, very, very much, sort of the shipwreck legacy of the Great Lakes. One of the pieces there is that he describes Native peoples in certain languages. And it's very, very, for our ears today, deeply troubling. And so one of the pieces is to say, when we ask who is telling that story, what is that, whose voices don't we hear? And I think that's an important piece to try to provide some balance and to ask that question. Another piece as we go forward from, say, Native peoples and European settlers, what are the sort of influences that bring people to opt to live in this place, right? So if you're going to have Europeans on the Eastern Seaboard, why would they come to Michigan, right? Why would they come to this place? What is their idea? How did Native peoples relate to each other? And another sort of component we'll go forward later on is the Americans. Why do the Americans come here? What are the reasons that they would opt to come to this place? And how, again, it relates back to the environment. It relates back to interactions with the native peoples and their own sort of interests. And I think those are questions we ask, is how do people really sort of interact with each other? And it's not just sort of an unbroken march. If United States history, sort of my home field, has a real habit of getting lost in names and dates, I think Scott would agree, state history gets even worse about that, to where it just really gets lost. And we try to break it down to find specific pieces and to ask those questions and to see how that influences these communities, to give it both a human perspective and to try to find those balances. So it isn't just that sort of piece. And it also raises those sorts of questions, how that sort of really interacts with each other, how to be both granular and also not to just get lost in, and then they came here, and then they came here, and then they came here. You know, it becomes almost like Trivial Pursuit. When we think about how historians use primary and secondary sources, this is a tough one even for my undergraduates, and even for the few grad students I have. They sometimes struggle with this. One of the pieces therein is, as I said, much of the written sources that are left are going to be from both Europeans, are going to be, say, priests who first came to the region, government officials, explorers, sometimes accounts of secondhand sources. Very few do we get written accounts of native peoples, and they come oftentimes through European mouths. And that's a real challenge for historians, because how do you both validate what native people are saying and to judge that, and yet how much of that is this the scribe, the writer of that source, how much of that is being done by that person to either make them look better or to excuse a behavior or to justify that can be tricky. And it's interesting to really struggle with that piece. So primary sources are incredibly valuable. You must have them. You cannot do without them. There's oral history. Native peoples have very rich oral histories. How do you both understand that? And for both groups, say for European and Americans and for native peoples, how do you not just take everything at face value? How do you not discount things out of hand? How do you engage those pieces? My undergraduates increasingly are struggling when we talk about how to teach state history is that they just need a primary source, and that's all. And one of the challenges that I ask folks is to say, well, what don't you know about this source? How about the language, right? How does the language change? One of the examples that's further down within here is going to be a narrative of Carolyn Kirkland. And Carolyn Kirkland was an early settler, and she comes to Michigan. She writes a sort of a popular novel. It's actually very readable. It's not a complex work, but it's a satire. And one of the challenges with that is that she says, oh, I wore these, and she comes in the 1830s, just before statehood. And she says, oh, I wore the wrong shoes and I had my silly wagon. And the students read it at face value and they go, oh, this is just, she's complaining. And they say, oh, she's so whiny. And I always smile to students. I always go, really? What did they do? Well, they had to chop down the trees and they had to go get dinner. And there was no, okay, yeah, maybe it's harder than we thought. And so how do we parse through that to think about what we don't know? And context matters for that. Secondary sources, so say books that are written by other, by people who are not in that time, who are writing like myself, who is a historian. How do we answer questions? Oftentimes the secondary sources can help us with context. They can help us to sort of see what was the larger connections and discussions that are going on about that issue. Oftentimes for some primary sources, there are silences. Stevens T. Mason, for example, the first governor, he left very few papers behind. And most of what we know about Stevens Mason was written by his political opponents and people who were angry at him. So many of the biographies you read of Mason from his own time, which are also primary sources, if you just read those, you would think he was a fool. And so the challenge is how do you go through that? And that's where, you know, oftentimes historians, we're pretty clear about it. We don't Monday morning quarterback, if you're familiar with that phrase. We don't go back and say, well, they should have did this and they should have did that. Part of it is to say, why did they do this? And the primary sources say, what was on their mind? Why would they do this? And sometimes those sources we can use to answer questions about their relationships that we wouldn't have thought. If we look at John Askin, who was one of the colonial administrators for the British at Fort Michilimackinac up in the at Mackinac City, and you can actually see his house at the village there today. His record books are fascinating. He would have viewed them as just, I sold this many beads, I sold this many blankets, but it tells you, he also tells you who he sold it to, what day he was doing it on, where they were at, what sort of season was it. So you can really look through there. So we can ask that source probably 15 different questions that poor John Askin, he never meant us to ask that question, but we're able to sort of penetrate that. But then we say, well, who is John Askin? Because he didn't leave a lot of stuff behind, or what he did leave behind, unfortunately, is not in Michigan. It's very far away. So the challenge is the secondary sources. There's a couple of articles in, say, things like Michigan History Magazine that the Historical Society of Michigan puts out that is very good and really can be utilized. So these pieces help us to understand who John Askin was, what these primary sources are, how did he interact, a European colonial administrator, interact with native peoples. And he also recorded how he got along with them. He also married a native woman, and she also enters into his narrative. So it's a way to sort of humanize it and see a very broad scope of that, and not at a graduate school level, but just at sort of a personal level. These folks wrote pretty simply, but the challenge is to say, what do we know? What don't we know? And to not fetish like one source or the other to the exclusion of anything else. I have a 7-year-old, and he loves you're sort of examining this stuff. I've sort of damaged him already, I think, to where he and I were just talking about this the other day. Is how do we look at these sources? How do we know who is telling what, and how do we put that together? And that's a lot of fun, because it's a challenge to think about how people tell things and how to relate that to each other. And there are a lot of decisions. And one of the other challenges that sort of like primary sources is that, much like Carolyn Kirkland, which is a satire, she uses wording and sort of narratives that we could think are as whiny or are very obscure. I always tell people, reading, for example, she writes at the same time as Charles Dickens. Reading Charles Dickens is sometimes really frustrating because he writes in a circle. They talk like they wrote. He uses allusions and metaphors that we have no idea what he's talking about. And he says, oh, yes, in London at this place. And we go, well, where is that? So too does Carolyn Kirkland in Michigan. She says, I was so far away, deep in the wilderness. She lived in Pinckney, which is about 15 miles north of Ann Arbor, not very far at all. And yet the difference between Ann Arbor and Pinckney in 1835 couldn't have been more different. They're on the frontier. One had a road, the other had nothing. And so it can be kind of fun to where if you read it, you go, oh, A, Kirkland is making fun of herself. B, she's saying, yes, we bought this land sight unseen. We have no idea. She encounters a Native American man, and she goes, well, this is her response to it. And it was sort of fun to figure out what he thought of them. And the sense is to look at that. But you had to sort of know that. There are several other sources that would say, well, we have plates and dishes and so forth. And if we didn't know what Michigan and the Great Lakes were like in 1830, you would think she was saying, look at me, I'm so great. But if you also consider who she's writing to, she was trying to lure her family to come out and live on the land that they bought, help them create a farm. And that's kind of fun because it's a challenge to think about what they had. These are not, heavy duty documents that are difficult for anyone to read, but they are interesting because you can even sort of have a lot of activity with that. And that's where primary sources, maybe not of like the Constitution, which is very important, the state constitution, of course, but these are human level ones that tell us, did people think about this? How did they live this? There's also, the State Archive has a great description of how you built a cabin. And most of my classes read it and say, no, that doesn't sound fun. But it's very helpful because suddenly they stop saying, oh, it's so easy, we could do this. They go, oh, this is really hard. Why would this be a problem? How do we have this? And it really raises those sorts of questions. The other thing I'll throw out about Kirkland is it's actually a great novel. It's openly available on the internet. The great sort of piece there too is what do you do too is to think about what happens to people who aren't successful. Kirkland writes the novel because she fails. And she goes bankrupt and they have to go back to New York State. And she writes the novel sort of mocking her own sort of piece. And it helps to get away from that unbroken march. I think probably Scott again would probably agree, the unbroken march to greatness. It tells us that, you know, things go well and things don't go well, that people have to sort of navigate that. And it really makes it a much more intimate piece of that sort of component. And you know, that's a really great opportunity. And that's how we sort of challenge those questions. So I'll stop now. Sorry.
Well, thank you, Matthew, that was great. Phil, so there are no specific standards about what a geographer does, unfortunately, but certainly something that we would like to know more about. So can you tell us about what a geographer does, and also share how your study of geography is similar and different to Matthew's study of history?
I have a PowerPoint that I will be happy to post up, but I'll give you the Cliff Notes version now because I want to save for a bigger PowerPoint a little bit later on. Where the historian's question is, what happened back then and how do we know and why does it matter? The geographer looks at exactly the same things, but our question is, why did it happen there? Why does that matter? And about 3 weeks ago, the US Department of Education released a summary statement about the NAEP test, you know, this international test of students. And they said that the social studies were absolutely scandalous, that students didn't know the meaning of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, that students didn't know what was in the Bill of Rights. And they couldn't even find important places on a map. And I thought, whoever wrote that particular document does not have a clue what geography is. Geography is not finding China on a map. Geography is not even what is China like. Those are just facts. They're the equivalent of saying history is something happened in 1492. What geography is, and like I say, this is the Cliff Notes version of it, is where you are has an important influence on what you can do. Well, let me expand that just a little bit. Where you are has an important influence on what you must do, or should do, or can do, or might do, or should not do, or cannot do. In other words, you can plant cotton in the Upper Peninsula. You probably should not, unless you are completely ignorant of geography. And we look at exactly the same things. We look at the old novels, we look at the old maps, we look at the records of explorers talking to indigenous people. But our question is, why are people doing the things that they're doing, where they're doing, and why does that matter? And I'll leave it there because I've got a little longer PowerPoint when we get to talk about regions, which there is a glick about. So I'm mute.
Awesome, thanks, Phil. All right, Joy. So I think the purpose of this standard is that we really want our third graders to start asking similar questions in their study of social studies topics. We want them to use similar sources as Matthew and as Phil. Can you provide some ideas of how to help our third graders become junior historians and junior geographers?
Well, I'll try. I know that these are really tough questions. Coming into third grade, a big piece of it is we have to assess what they've learned so far. And what we're finding a lot of times is that they don't have the background knowledge. So we kind of have to start with that. But when we do start with the history of Michigan, we do talk about the indigenous people and who were here first. And it has been, you alluded to this earlier and mentioned this, that it has been difficult to find true primary resources that are appropriate for a third grade level and on a third grade readability level. But we've been working really hard to try to find some of these sources. And but we do look at the indigenous people, and we look at the people of the Three Fires, which we look at the Odawa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi, and how they worked together and to form an alliance. We have also really worked hard to find written work is been more of a challenge. Sometimes we look at a primary resource as maybe a farmer's diary, or something like that, that kind of gives us an idea of what things were like. We do look at maps a lot, sometimes of the blueprints of some farms and things like that, so we can get some idea, but we're kind of pulling at all different levels. But we're asking the third graders to start being more aware of some of the things, and how things came to be. And we look at we do talk about a lot of the names of cities and where did they derive from, what brought that, how did those places get names. We live in, our school district is in Ottawa County. Where did that come from? Then there's Allegan County, you know, there's so many, but then there's Charlevoix County also. So you think about where did those names derive from. We have really worked some with and some indigenous people, and we worked with Eric Hemingway, who is from the Odawa tribe, who's given us a lot of great resources. And more than anything, he's given us the perspective of the indigenous people that we have not always had. And so as we have been working with these standards and the curriculum that we've been trying to bring together, we're really trying to make sure that all voices are heard. So that's definitely some of the ways that we're trying to address these, but it has been certainly challenging, but we're just trying to get more books that would, there's not a lot of textbooks. We find that we can pull excerpts from things, but we don't have a lot of like real books. And that is one thing that we do want to address, because that's been a false advertisement in some ways. I know that right now a lot of our the third grade teachers in the past have taught these, I'm going to bring this book up called like The Legend of Sleeping Bear. A lot of these legends, who's telling this legend, you know what I mean? And that's one of the standards later on, that there was very specific in these standards that they wanted us to be able to tell the history of the Anishinaabe, which included the people of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. So we're finding that a legend is great if you're telling this from a literature standpoint. This is just a legend. That legend is a story that's just passed down from one generation to another. But if you really look into the indigenous people, a legend is not typically even written down. It's something that's very sacred. It's told at a certain time period. And so we really struggled with some of the resources and continuing to look for some of those things and have those vetted. But you know, I used to love reading all those legends books, and you can still do that. We're not saying not to do, but you can't do that saying that that is the legend of Michigan, and the things that go along with that. I'm sure that there's parts of it that might have been you know, tied to authenticity at some point in time, but we can't vet that. So then we have to just move on and find out what we can. So there are some resources that Phil's going to share with you later on the PowerPoint. But one of the things I would really ask the participants, if you do find a book or resource that comes across your, you know, your eyes, that you would be willing to share, because we're always on the lookout for books that would be appropriate for third grade. And there are a lot of really good stories out there. There are a lot of good stories, but they're not always third grade appropriate. They're quite you definitely couldn't share that with third grade. So that's just something that that we share. So just getting back to, you know, the primary resources, we do look at maps. We ask a lot of questions about the maps. We ask lots of questions about just the resources that we do have. And we do have one very, very, very good primary resources that is just, I mean, I'm blessed that we have this, but this is a story about Alexander Henry. And if you're not familiar with Alexander Henry, he was captured by an indigenous tribe, and he was able, and this is in the 1700s, so he was able to go be with this family for a whole year. So we had the winter season, we had the summer season, we had each season, and he kept a diary of that. And that's attached to this as well, but that is an incredibly valuable resource for third graders that we use, and we just really take that story and break that down. And so that is definitely one that we use a lot. So hope that answers your question about that.
All right, well, thanks so much, Joy. That was great. So Phil, we just talked about students using the same sources as geographers in their study of Michigan. One geography standard says use a variety of visual materials and data sources to describe ways in which Michigan can be divided into regions. So what we would like to do now is, could you and Joy offer some information about what regions are and some of the visual materials and data sources teachers should use with their students to help them describe how Michigan can be divided into regions. And I think this is the point where you have a PowerPoint to share, so I'm going to stop sharing and let you take control of the screen.
While Phil is bringing up his presentation, I just wanted to point out that Amanda Weinert is with us, and she was one of the people who helped us with the open book materials, and she threw into the chat that she recommends using the wording we put into the standards, traditional story. And she also shared a couple of links and advised against using some of the Sleeping Bear Press books. So thank you for that, Amanda.
Yeah.
And with that, take it away, Phil.
Yeah, so what I'm trying to do is just summarize what the Giants team, Joy and Lindsay and other Dave, have put together about this concept of regions. Regions, as you know, is one of the 5 themes of geography. The problem is the 5 themes were written back in the 1980s, and we've done an awful lot of neuroscience about how student brains actually process information since then. Nevertheless, the concept of region is still important for a lot of people here. So let's take a quick look at the standards. If you look at the first 4 standards there, it's talking about thematic maps to describe the characteristics of parts of Michigan. They're talking about describing Michigan's location, how regions are created, and how Michigan specifically can be divided into regions. In other words, about half of the geography standards are about regions. I think that there's 2 more that ought to go without saying, even though they're not written in the standards. And one of them is do what you're going to do in 3rd grade in a way that will not undermine what they're going to be doing in 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th. And one of the strengths of the Giants program is that we've had all of these grade levels working more or less at the same time. In fact, my wife is on 4th and 6th grade. I'm on 3rd and 5th. And we think it should go without saying that you use maps of topics that informed citizens should know. That is, the maps the kids are using right now are the ones that they're going to remember. It would probably be better to do it about the Odawa rather than about, oh, I don't know, zombie sightings or UFO, the kind of things that some people think that ought to be a kid-friendly topic to teach about maps. The problem is the kid will remember that map better than almost any other map that they work with. And then the most important standard, don't just make good lessons. The internet is just full of good lessons. The problem is they're hiding out there among 1,000 bad lessons. You should design a curriculum of lessons that could be used alone, But if you use them, they will support each other, they will scaffold important ideas, and they will link with history, civics, economics, literacy, math. So we've been working on a package of materials that teach about the regions of Michigan. There's 7 parts to this, and I'm going to just read through them fairly fast because you guys will get this PowerPoint later. The first component is a separate PowerPoint that's up on the Giants website, and it explains step by step, how do you define a region, how do you draw a region, how do you describe that region, what are some complications that come when you try to make a regional map of a more complicated topic. Second is immediately there are some student activities. And one of the ones that seems a little bit weird is that they try to make a map of the region of nut trees. There's a reason for that. When immigrants came to Michigan, the immigrant guidebook that they were handed on the East Coast said, when you go out to claim your homestead on there, you should look for nut trees because these are an indicator of good land for farming. And if you have in your mental map a region of nut trees, you've got a region of corn in Michigan. Then the next question is, there's a whole stack of other student activities that reinforce this skill with other topics on other days. And one of the questions that you would ask is, of the 3 groups that Joy mentioned earlier, which ones lived in the region of nut trees? Because nuts were an important trade good back at that time. Now, we've got another activity that has kids making a snow map out of raw data so that there's a math activity that supports this concept of region. We've got a number of children's books that Joy will talk about a little bit more later on. And nuts turned out to have been an important trade good with the Potawatomi people traded nuts to the Ojibwe up north in order to get birch bark to make their canoes. Other children's books are about maize. Like I say, we're going to have a whole list. In fact, I'm going to put this screen up at the end and have Joy talk about it a little bit if she wants. We can follow this story in lots of different ways. And we did put together a short PowerPoint just for teachers about an interesting building near Oklahoma City. This is the Citizen Potawatomi Nation Cultural Heritage Center. And inside there's a spectacular museum with what the bark wigwams used to look like back up in Michigan, even though there's no tree in Oklahoma that would ever build this kind of thing. The Potawatomi are kind of unique. They signed more than 40 treaties, each of which guaranteed them certain rights that were promptly abrogated a little bit later on. This is a civics lesson about the power of the federal government vis-a-vis state, provincial, territorial, county, other kinds of governments. And eventually the Potawatomi were forced to leave against their will. I just showed you 5 pictures out of a 45 picture background from that museum on the theory that a lot of teachers can't go to Oklahoma to look at the museum. And when the Potawatomi were forced to move to Oklahoma, there wasn't a big nut tree in sight. In other words, their culture about growing corn and selling nuts and hunting had to be completely rewritten. We do use a lot of historic maps. And by the way, if you've got a nice little map of nut trees in your head, you've also got a map of where the counties were at the time of statehood. The southern region was already divided into counties. The north was still called the land of the Ottawas and the Chippewas, or Ojibwe. Note that the Potawatomi are no longer here. They were the ones unfortunate enough to live in the part of Michigan that Europeans wanted. Remember, we started this whole thing with a simple map of nut trees. We made a region of nut trees. Can you explain how that region of nut trees helps explain the current pattern of land use in the year 2000? Or let me move this a little bit closer. How about taking a look at coronavirus cases in Michigan and how the same region that you have, the principle is that if you make a good map of an important topic, and nut trees turns out to be important, it can help you interpret a lot of other maps and make those other maps easier to remember. To support that, we've got wall and floor maps with the map of corn over here and the inset here. This particular map is available as a wall map or a 8x8 floor map that the kids can crawl around on. The way Joy and Lindsay set this up, the kids are all making a little notebook of maps that they can make notes on as they're doing things. And they're actually pushing a canoe around on this map in order to show where Alexander Henry went. So the literacy piece has been brought into this floor map activity.
There's also copper in that left corner up there in the Keweenaw Peninsula. Those are little copper pieces. And so they're about to make a region based on where that copper is in the Keweenaw Peninsula. But yet they have a question because there's copper up here, but there's also copper on Isle of Royal. So what to do? How do you make your region? State your case.
So all of these maps, the snow map, the pine tree map, the corn map, the population map, are part of the next component, which is an electronic map that Dave has put up on the WMS-ISD website. And these clickable maps can aid geographic inquiries, and we can play around with this. I've got it up on my screen a little bit later on if there's any questions about it. There are dozens of these maps designed by the Michigan Geographic Alliance for all grade levels. There's American history maps and world history maps. I'll show all of these URLs at the end here, but you can click on this thing and you can see a map of heavy snow, and you can make a map of snow regions and tie that, or you can make a map of tree lines, or you can make a map of current day population. So to teach about regions in Michigan, what a team of people have been doing for about the last, 2.5 years is working out a presentation to explain the concept, having a major student activity to practice the skill immediately, have at least 5 more activities that use that skill with other topics, link it with a number of content-rich children's books. There are a series of historic maps of different kinds going all the way back to the 1700s, 1600s. Their wall and floor maps are a lot of fun. The kids seem to enjoy crawling around on the floor and pushing canoes around. And there is this clickable electronic map that the students can access anytime they've got their access to a computer. Except for the presentation, these different elements might take only a couple minutes on a given day. In other words, we're talking about a novel at a particular time in the past, and the novel mentions a copper mine, and then we put up the map of copper for about 30 seconds and then come back. The point is you keep reinforcing that mental map of what Michigan looks like. This is a list of the activities that are already available up on the Giants website. We'll give you that URL later. There's a handful of these URLs, but again, you'll get this in Scott's thing. I'm just going to kind of stop on this frame here because it's got a couple of the books that Joy and Lindsay have decided that they really like working with. And you want to say anything about that now, Joy, or later on? Earth calling, Joy?
You're muted, Joy.
Yeah, I can talk about it now. These are some of the best resources that we found. Again, we're always looking for good resources that are third grade appropriate. But and Phil talked about life in an Anishinaabe camp, and the pictures in this book really do tell a story as well. And they really create a visual for third graders that really help them to see what it was like in a home. And they had the wigwams, and then they had the long houses and at different seasons, and it wasn't just one small family that lived in these. It was it was a generational family. And so those are just some things for I just think a visual piece is important. Shingabis is one of the legends, a true authentic legend that does connect with the Anishinaabe. The thing about about Shingabis is it's just it's not a exhilarating story, to say the least. You know what I mean? It needs some help. And so, but it's definitely something that's, at least it's authentic right now. So we're always looking for those legends. And we do have that available where you can listen to it on, and there's a video of that as well. And A Year in the Life of Alexander Henry, that's not one that you just read through one time. That's something that you really dissect and take apart, and you can use that throughout many lessons. So and that one is in the Giants, that's just something that's downloadable. You can easily print that out and let the kids use that throughout the year. That's definitely our favorite. I'm really excited about this new book right here, and it's called Bow Wow Powwow, and I actually have that here with me. I discovered this book, and it's won an award this year, but I like that it shows the life of a modern day Indigenous person. But what you find in this book that is rare to find is that it is bilingual. It is, you've got two stories. You've got the English version, but then you also have Ojibwe as well. So it tells that right away. And it's just rare that you find a book that is, especially modern day, that it is bilingual in the Ojibwe language. So it's fun for us to even learn one new word in the Ojibwe language. And I think that helps with just teach that multicultural piece as well. 13 Moons on a Turtle's Back really is a fun story, just showing how the indigenous people didn't have clocks, like we do. And so they told stories. Their time was told by seasons. If it was strawberry season, when was that? That was probably around this time right now. So that's another good book that just breaks it down little by little. You don't have to, and this is a picture book. This is a picture book. This is a picture book. A lot of these are picture books. And then we have a chapter book right here. And this is a story by, we have Gloria Whalen here, and The Night of the Full Moon. And this is a really good story that ties in the life of the pioneers, because this is a pioneer. And as they're coming in, the indigenous people are being pushed out, and that alludes to that, and to the we here, I think we're more familiar with the people of the Trail of Tears with the Cherokee people, but the indigenous people in Michigan, the Potawatomi, they were also pushed out as well, and they had a trail that went through Indiana and further southwest. So that's something that addresses that a little bit there, and what life was like as the pioneers start coming in, and then the military get involved. So that's just another perspective. And Gloria Whalen is from Michigan. She writes some really good stories about that. And then we also have this is The Birch Bark House. And this is true. This is a really good story. This is a great story, just chapter book. It's not a chapter book that you're going to read through. You're going to take excerpts from this. It starts out with, there's a sad story. They find a baby. They take another. You just take the baby in. There's no foster home. There's no, to take it to. You just bring it along with your own family, and just what life was like on a day-to-day basis is what this story is mainly about. But it's a really good story as well. So those are just some of the stories. Another one that I like to read a lot is The Voyager's Paddle. And now this is by Kathy Jo Wargent also, but it really does tell the story of when the French come in to Michigan and what their role is. And if you look on the very first page, I like how this story just tells about, well, not the first page, but you can see, I hope you can see this a little bit, but you've got a fort here, but what do you have off to the fort? You have your wigwam. So they work together. They have to work together. How do they get around? What's their mode of transportation? You see the birch bark canoe. So some of those things just, and then you can see, let's see if I can get you can see there's the, I don't know if you can see it. I'm trying to get the French flag is in view. Let me see where it's back here. Here's the French flag is back here. So you can see it maybe a little bit there. But that just kind of tells you a little bit. But then you also see where the voyagers came, And then now they have, here's the voyager, and now this is his wife. And so now they have intermarried, and just what life was like in that piece of it as well. But it really just talks about how the indigenous people and the voyagers lived together, but what voyagers also, what their role was, and why they were even here. But it also shows how they traded with each other. Now, that's not the end of the story for sure, because this also depicts a little bit where they're just working together so nicely, and that's not really the case if you dig a little deeper. The French more or less tolerated, the indigenous people tolerated the French, but it's not like they were bosom buddies there. So, and we do address that in My Open Book and in The Giants as well. In My Open Book, we have a spreadsheet of what the indigenous people's perspective were, and then what the British, their perspective was, and then we do the same thing. So when the French, well, French came first, so with the French and the indigenous people, and then when the British came with their perspective and the indigenous perspective. And I don't think that you always get that in curriculum. So those are some of the books that we read and recommend, and the kids really enjoy those. So hope that helps.
And all I had was the list here, but again, you will get that, I think, in Scott's. So I will unshare unless there's a quick question.
All right, well, thank you so much. That was really, really great. I'm sure everyone appreciates all of the materials and literature you provided there in your PowerPoint. So we're going to switch gears just a little bit, and we're going to go kind of back to looking at some of the history standards. So basically, one of the standards says, use case studies or stories to describe how the ideas or actions of individuals affected the history of Michigan pre-statehood. So Matthew, we were wondering if you could explain what a case study is.
Yeah, a case study would be the use of a smaller sort of set of sources or concepts to examine a larger topic. So it would be along the lines of looking at a smaller set of materials. So if you were going to be sort of looking at why, certain county would support statehood or not, would be to look at a particular person or individuals or group of individuals who would be sort of making the case for statehood or not, and to be able to look at them and then to ask questions, how did they fit that into the larger discussion of statehood or settlement and so forth. And that's a really big sort of component there. One would be a way to look at things such as Tecumseh, right? Tecumseh is not, we have a city named for him, but the native leader, the Shawnee leader from Ohio, and lived in Kentucky. But what we would do is that he's going to be a particular person during the War of 1812. And will create sort of a Native American alliance, and by which there is actually a rather large amount of material left from his sort of effort to create his own essentially country. You could think of it as about 20 years later, you're going to have something along the lines of that with the Cherokee in Georgia and Tennessee and areas. So the concept is that you would look at him and how does that influence the decisions by sort of Native leaders and those sorts of sources. So for example, that would be one. Another one would be to look at, as I mentioned earlier, Carolyn Kirkland or some of the other settlers to say, how did their response to this location, these places, some of the maps come together to shape their sort of consideration of settlement to Michigan? We could ask that sort of question. And to say, why would people come here? How do those things sort of come along? There's a great deal of that. There are actually, another example could be newspapers. Newspapers would be written to a very common level for the public, and some of the open source ones, the state library has a number that actually have it clipped of advertisements for land purchases, and there are actually maps and other sources that would allow for that sort of to examine, much as Phil enjoyed it indicated. And the students can sort of say, where you're at. Is this a good place to have a farm, to come here and to settle? What will you find? Will you be in there? And to examine why people would come there. Another example could be why certain groups would come to the Upper Peninsula, or why Native communities would sort of make a treaty and make a negotiation to relinquish control of their land. That's all sort of pieces or a case study. So it doesn't just become one long thing after another. It is a focused, structured, manageable discussion that can then be linked to a larger concept, and sort of keep away from the sort of the and this and this and this and this. And so there is a great deal of ability to work with a case study, and it can be also at a local level. Many times local libraries, historical societies, even at the various universities will have those sources that can be drawn and are very eager to work with that. Many times they put that together, it's just not digitized. And so, but those sorts of pieces could be really worked with. So it's a manageable size to examine those pieces, to focus on a specific person, group of people, location, or a particular source.
All right, well, great. So a follow-up question for you. So as I said earlier, one of the promises and problems of open standards is, who should we teach? This opens up the ability for teachers to bring individuals and groups who are often underrepresented in history standards and textbooks. However, there are so many important people in the history of Michigan that can and should be studied. So who are some individuals or groups you would recommend we discuss in our third grade classrooms, and can you tell us more about them? Also, what are some sources we can use, you mentioned some already, that we can use to learn more information about these individuals?
Yeah, one of the major pieces that we would do for, especially for Native communities, has been heavily discussed, and a lot of those sources are on here, and those various groups are very important, and not just things such as what the British would call Pontiac and so forth, but many of the communities are going to be their names are sometimes pushed aside and so forth. But what we would think of is looking at oftentimes many of the treaties. I did include a link to Central Michigan's site that actually has all of the Native American treaties, the major ones, not the individuals, but the very large treaties, the Treaty of Chicago, for example, that along with the sort of the sort of the various maps that were shared, where nut trees, settlers were. This is also where people would be able to purchase land, where Native peoples had been essentially forced off their land or moved, or had been allowed to stay for a certain time and move forward. That is oftentimes in those discussions and that are written into the treaty themselves, Native peoples' words. And oftentimes that, in a modern sense, is where the discussion for treaty respect and that discussion, you can get a real sense of that sort of piece. For those sorts of pieces. Oftentimes too, you can have various people such as Henry Rose Schoolcraft, who was the Native American federal agent for Native Americans, who participated in a huge number of these treaties and signings. Many of his records are actually available through a website called Hathitrust. That's Google Books with a proper search engine. And it's written to a pretty straight level, but many times, Schoolcraft, even though he represented the federal government, utilized a great deal of power, was pretty good about writing down what various groups had to say for themselves. And you certainly have to sort through it, but it is an interesting voice to where he sort of had a Native American wife. He lived in these communities, traveled throughout the state, gives a lot of very firsthand accounts. So Schoolcraft is very interesting. He's a quirky guy to be sure, but he's an interesting. Rix Robinson from Grand Haven will establish many of who also a white, a British-born settler who will marry a Native American woman. His partner offered oftentimes a great deal of discussion and was his entrepot through her family connections. And her voice is heard through Robinson's materials, which are also digitized and are available through a host of locations. And so he's another sort of a window. He is a person who in many cases wrote and dealt very respectfully with Native peoples, but was also caught up in removal as well. So he has sort of this very tough thing to figure out because he both, and this was especially for Western Michigan by the Grand River in that area, who at times was very troubled by what his role was, but he didn't back off either. And so that's an interesting piece to combine within there. So Rix Robinson is someone who doesn't get as much play as that. Carolyn Kirkland is another person. She is a very interesting woman. She is one of the first successful women novelists. And her book, which is included in the links, Our New Home in the West, takes a very different view of settlement. It isn't just all sunshine. I always kind of joke that it's a little bit like the Donner Party from Michigan, right? No one ends up sort of devolving into crisis, but it's a very, very sort of a different take on settlement. It isn't just, and we got here and it was great. They get here and it's a very frank discussion, even though it's a satire of what they faced. And it was very difficult and how everyone didn't always get along. So it's a very different voice within here, that sort of piece, to be able to hear those sort of discussions. In addition, there is another a Methodist minister by the name of John Pitezel, Pitizel. And Pitezel wrote a series of letters and later was as a book of his travels through Michigan. And he also really dealt with Native people very well. He was sort of an interesting character. He went to the copper country in the 1840s. He traveled everywhere and had a really interesting take on those interactions and was, for his time, very troubled by what was going on in house statehood. Another person in an outside view from who really was sort of has his own take was Alexis De Tocqueville, Democracy in America. I want to say it's chapter 35. He traveled all the way into Saginaw, pre-statehood, and was absolutely fascinated by both Native peoples and as his own words, attempted to really try to negotiate that. And we don't think of it. Tocqueville was French. He came after the Napoleonic Wars to study American prison reform and found himself enthralled with Americans, and wrote for a European audience going, these people are wacky and you should keep an eye on them. And so it's a very interesting perspective as well. Another one would be Madame La Framboise, who is going to be who's going to marry into a series of the Campos and a series of other sort of settlers, and who was partially Native American and had sort of that biracial perspective on settlement, on interactions with Native peoples, the treaty process. Her work is also very, very interesting because she sort of is stuck between two worlds and discusses that, and had a role in trade and settlement, but also was very troubled by that. So using these individuals as case studies is very helpful because it gets us away from just very high level political discussion. Some of that statehood stuff, boy, it really gets, it can be a real slog, and that's for the upper grades. But these are stories of people to help many times try to give a more human perspective on that. In addition, I would also suggest that there are a series of materials in Michiganology, which is the State Archives of Michigan, that talks about building, and the Michigan Historical Museum has a series of materials that are available. They were working on digitizing them before the pandemic, on how you build a cabin. How did you build different types of houses? How did you salt meat? How did you get food? And to be able to have settler accounts. And these are very, very helpful to be able to find that sort of material for case studies of those individuals. So it isn't just Stevens T. Mason and so on and so forth. It's a host of people from Tecumseh on down to Madame La Framboise, through Carolyn Kirkland, through Rix Robinson, people who are coming to these places and are really trying to sort of sort that out. And they are very, very interesting to see those connections within there.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Those were, again, more great resources. Thank you. So I just want to ask Joy a question as well. Who are some important individuals in Michigan's pre-statehood that you have discussed in your third grade classes? What are some of the case studies or stories or children's lit that you use with your students to learn more about these figures?
Well, we really talk more about what leads up to becoming a state, and we talk about the influence of the Erie Canal and how that definitely plays a part in people getting to Michigan, and how that allows people to to get to the point where they can homestead there. And we tie in that geography with that as well. We also talk about with the Erie Canal, and before we could become a state, we were a territory. So we really go over, and you know, for third grade, we have to break things down because they have such a limited background most of the time when they come to third grade, and that's where third and fourth grade standards both do a lot of overlapping with each other. And so as we have gleaned through these, we have found that for third grade, we have decided to cap it at statehood. And then the pioneer stage of coming in and the growth of Michigan kind of falls into the fourth grade curriculum. But one of the things that I would say that we talk about is we talk about Pontiac and his rebellion and what and the part he played in that. We talk about Lewis Cass a little bit. We do talk about Stevens T. Mason. We're trying to talk a little bit more about Miss Framboise, because she was not just she also we come at her a little bit as an economic she was an entrepreneur and a woman entrepreneur, and you don't see that a lot. So that's another one that we are working on currently. But we talk about the main things of Michigan needs to have 60,000 people, and it needs to have a constitution before it can become a state. So those are the basics. But then we also tie in the Toledo conflict and how that comes to be, because that has to be resolved before they will allow us to become a state. So that's the war that a shot wasn't even fired. So we talk about some of those things that kind of lead up to the, so we talk more about events that happen that lead up to it rather than specific people. I mean, we do talk about Pontiac. He's not necessarily one that led up to statehood, but we do talk about his role as well. But we mainly talk about the role of the Erie Canal, that has now allowed people to be able to get to Michigan, and once they get to Michigan, the hardships that they face. It's not, we look at Michigan, at least the southern part of Michigan, we see northern too, but all these trees. But when the settlers first came, it was swampy, and it was, the roads were, it was really, it was really tough getting here. And it was no land for farming at that point in time. It was all the trees. So if you were coming over to Michigan and you had been a farmer, you've got a problem. You got to cut down the trees before you can have fertile soil. And so just some of those dynamics of how things came to be, but definitely the role of the Erie Canal played a big part of it. We do read a story called The Log Cabin Quilt, and that's just a story by Ellen Howard, and that's a story of these people come from Michigan, and just the hardship of the mom had died, and a lot of times people came to Michigan, and there was no housing market wasn't big here, so they had to just start like with a lean-to before they could actually build the log cabin and what that was like. And so a lot of times we talk to a lot of we really focus on a lot of the events that take place during that time period.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much. So I'm gonna have a follow-up question for you, Joy. Obviously, everyone here is a social studies nerd, and we love social studies, but we also probably understand, especially our third grade teachers, that social studies may not be the most focused on discipline or subject in the third grade. So I was just curious, can you, some of the ideas you just talked about, the stories, the events, when it comes to social studies, you've already given us a lot of great children's lit. But is there any way you can kind of just briefly talk about how you can integrate some of these ideas that we've already discussed with English language arts? Because we know that English language arts and reading is obviously super important in our elementary schools. And how can we bring in some of these social studies ideas to that discipline?
Well, we've really tried to focus a little bit like I know with K through 2, we have really been giving them a lot of resources that they can use to tie in history and social studies and geography with their literacy piece of it. The problem we have is we are so stereotypical, and we are continuing to put social studies in these columns. You know, we put, here's social studies, here's writing, here's reading, and really that's not the design. That's not the way that it needs to be. It really needs to be integrated, and that's one thing we've been working on with Phil, is to integrate all these things. And when we talk about the snow graph, that's even tying in math with that. So a lot of times what we do is I might start out with a reading story earlier in the day, but then when I have social studies later in the day, then I can tie back to that, and we can constantly keep going back to that. So I use it to teach character traits, you know, when we're studying certain people. I use it to teach, to tie in analogies and metaphors and figurative language. We talk about their vocabulary, especially when we talk about the Ojibwe. We really kind of delve into that a little bit and kind of tie these things in together. And then we do a lot of writing about it. You know, we really try to step into the story, you know, especially when we talk about Alexander Henry. You know, I mean, what would we have done? How would we have responded? How is it different from then than it is today? You know, I mean, I think it just helps them to see those things a little differently. So we kind of integrate those things together, and we and not so much of the columns. So that's something that I focus on. It's not, this is just reading time. I can read those stories throughout, and we're always, throughout the whole year, we tie back to those stories, because so many times one story leads to another story and then another story. So those are that's how we kind of integrate that into our third grade classrooms.
Awesome, great, thank you. So we're at the point now, I think, where we've received a lot of great information, and we were just wondering, were there any questions from the audience or those who are watching the webinar? I don't know if Adam and Dave, you could read any of those off to us, and the panel will be happy to answer any questions, or if you have any questions, please feel free to put those in the chat, and we'll take a little bit of a time out here and answer some of your questions.
While questions are going in the chat, you guys have made my life difficult with the archival purposes of this, with all these fantastic resources shared both from the presenters and from the folks joining us to learn from our presenters this evening. So I have no idea how I'm going to incorporate all of this outside of maybe attaching the chat transcript to everything, but that's great stuff. So what questions? Not seeing anything pop in the chat, but I'll practice some wait time here and get back with you in a sec.
All right, yeah, so wait time is important as we're all learning, teaching, and presenting online. So yeah, we'll give the panelists some time to get some water real quick, me as well. And in about a minute or so, we'll just kind of move on to a few more standards that we wanted to talk about.
Yeah, I did that earlier too. You would think after 7 webinars that I'd have this down. Linda asked if we've incorporated the C3 framework into some of the third grade work. I know Open Book definitely has. Joy, Giants?
Yes, we did. We looked at all that. We tied it all in. And with Michigan Open Book, we tied in Michigan Open Book also with the Giants. And then there's more great stuff in the Michigan Open Book, and I would use, and that's always been written as a supplemental resource. So it's never been written as the main resource, but it definitely does supplement the curriculum for the Giants. And we definitely looked at the C3 framework and make sure what we covered and what things were also covered in the new standards with 4th grade as well. And then we also, Michigan Open Book is still a really good resource also to continue to use for students with enrichment, and just have that true inquisitive spirit about what else is the other parts of Michigan as they become a pioneer, as as the lumbering takes place and the mining and some of those things, and people come from other places. That's a great way to offer just enrichment activities with that. But yes, we did look at the C3 framework and vetted that with each one.
And then the other question that popped up in the chat, I'm gonna mic drop this one and just be like, all right, here we go. Who's got it? With the uncertainty of next year, how do you think history can best be taught? And I think they're probably getting at here, especially to those early elementary students like third graders. I mean, they're in the mid-range there, but having 2 third graders myself who just experienced online learning, what do you guys think? How can history best be taught?
I'll jump in on that one, even though I'm the host. I think that's a great question. I think that, and I'm thinking about writing a piece on this because I think, especially if you're doing online stuff, I think this is really a great chance for us to really test the theory of the C3 framework, using multiple sources, having kids come up with the conclusions, because again, I'm not sure if, we're going to have the same, for all grade levels, same pressures of the standardized test that we worry about in older grades, as well as, some of the younger elementary grades. So I think that, using a primary, secondary source, having your child or your students come up with a conclusion based on and use evidence to support their claims, I think that perhaps for the first time, you may actually have time to do this. Because honestly, what else are you going to do? I have an 8th grader, and we've done things like do an inquiry-based gardening project. We looked at elements of the global economy, and then really looking at multiple sources. So my suggestion would be, if we are in a situation where you're teaching online or have time or have less students, to really think about taking these ideas of inquiry-based practices, using multiple sources, and see how well they actually work. I think they work. I know I've used them in my classes, both with my undergrad students in their particular classrooms, as well as when I taught 8th grade. So I think that it could be, again, kind of a promise when it comes to really bringing these ideas of inquiry and evidence and that sort of thing to our social studies classroom. I don't necessarily think there's gonna be a lot of dates and facts like Matthew talked about that we may have to worry about for a while. So if that's the case, I would definitely recommend doing that.
I will say one thing that was nice during this remote learning period was that the Giants program and the Michigan Open Book were really set up well to work with technology. And so I felt like we were able to delve into it a little further than we normally would be, even in the classroom, because we could give several resources, sometimes an article, sometimes a map, sometimes an activity, sometimes a slideshow, but I felt like it was a really good opportunity. It just lended itself really nice to remote learning. I could say that's one positive, that we had that curriculum in place that really went well with that. So I felt like we really were able to do a nice job. And I was really thankful that our district did put an emphasis on that it wasn't just going to be about reading and writing or reading and math. It was going to also be science and social studies as well. So I was really thankful that didn't get pushed way just flat off the stove, not just off the back burner, but so that was good. And we really used those resources and I thought it was very productive.
The only thing I'll add before I turn it over to Scott again is right before this webinar, Rebecca Bush did a presentation on taking skills from the C3 framework, and I think there are some nuggets in there that would be useful for you to look at if we end up in this situation again next fall. And then last week I did mine on adapting inquiry for remote and blended learning. And so the resources that are on the MCSS website to go along with that, and the video recap for both of those videos would be worth taking a look at too, for some ideas. None of us have the right answer. If we did, you'd be seeing much nicer houses behind us. But those are some places to look for some starting points. Scott, over to you.
Okay, well, I'm looking at my phone here, and it looks like we're at 7:24. So this is great. It's a lot of information, and I don't think, I mean, we could talk about this until 10 tonight, I'm sure, but we're going to kind of close things out a bit. I do want to ask one more question to Matthew and Phil and Joy as well, and then we're going to share just kind of a recap of some resources to kind of help answer, I think, some of the questions that were already asked. And then I think we'll open up to more questions and/or call it a night. So thank you so much for your participation so far. And but let's talk a little bit about content integration, both from a geographer and a historian's viewpoint, as well as a teacher's viewpoint. So as you all know, the subject of social studies is not just history and not just geography or economics or government. It's a subject that should be taught in an integrated way. Though the standards are listed by discipline, there is certainly no reason why you can't combine several standards in one lesson or unit plan. There are many standards in third grade social studies that work well together. For example, geography standard, using thematic maps to identify and describe the physical and human characteristics of Michigan, goes really well with the history standard, describe how Michigan attained statehood. So the first question I have is for Phil and Matthew. How do you both in your jobs, how do you use elements of the other social sciences in your own work?
Well, in this silence here, I've been looking at the C3 framework not as an overall framework, but looking for where are the little nuts and bolts pieces that help smooth that out a little bit. And one thing that you'll find if you look through the third grade Giants package up online is that there are about 25 one-page activities that make use of a primary or secondary source of some kind. There's one about surveyor notes. There's one about an old Bellin map. There's one about an archaeological site and what people found and how that would tell you about the trade goods. And we took a look at those great sources and then said, what would a teacher who doesn't know anything about that particular source need in order to get started with this? And then wrote those up as one-page activities. And like I say, I could show you a couple of them, but it would be better just to go out and look at the Giant site and download some of those one-page activities, because those were all set up. I was part of the team that wrote the C3 package for geography. And so it just permeates what I do. And the first question in one of these activities would be a simple factual question. The second one asked you to put two ideas together. The third question would extend that out, and then the fourth question would connect it over to another discipline. The activities are deliberately structured to mimic that arc of inquiry that C3 has, and then say, this is now a skill that you can use for the following topics. And then it goes open-ended. And like I say, I think that some teachers need that little nuts and bolts starter for a topic where they're not that familiar, because they don't have time to be looking up, you know, every single book that we've mentioned here so far. But all of the books that Joy pointed to, there is a one-page reading guide activity already written and up on the Giant site. Like I say, it's a package that 5 or 6 talented people have been working on for 2.5 years.
Yeah, and I guess I would say too, you know, even though I don't have all the great learning sort of packages, is to when we think about, you know, Michigan attaining statehood as we go through, you know, what Joy mentioned earlier, was that there was a whole set of processes to go there through that sort of material. The State Archives of Michigan, which is Michiganology, actually has some really great lesson plans and some really usable materials to walk you through how Michigan attained statehood and pieces of the Constitution and sort of that sort of connections. And I think that would really be very useful. And it also draws on various maps and why certain areas would want certain things. And it really does draw together because it wasn't, you know, statehood in Michigan wasn't either easy or necessarily clean. And it also draws in on, you know, clashes over surveyors. Where is the line? And then where does it go for surrounding areas and states? Who is here first? And it can be very sort of conceptual. And I think that's a much better way to approach it than some sort of high level discussion of governance policy, which sometimes it gets, at least that was my experience with it. But I think really drawing on those resources that are available, particularly through the Archives of Michigan and the state library, I think would really be the most useful pieces. And I really do connect those pieces for my own students as well, to try to keep it from just discussing, you know, very esoteric. It makes it much more human.
Perfect. Well, I think what we're going to do is first, thank you so much for spending the last hour and a half with us. It flew by for us. Hopefully it flew by for y'all too. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to move on. If you can hang with us a few more minutes, we've all provided some resources for you, more resources in PowerPoint form. So basically I'm going to skip to these last few slides. And I would like each of the presenters to please, you know, talk about all or just a few of the sites you provided, and we'll kind of close out that way. So first we have Joy talking about some of her work and some organizations that she has worked with.
Sorry. The Michigan Open Book is this site, and this is also going to give you access to the no, this is the clickable maps, but this one is also, we really worked closely with some Indigenous people to get their perspective on this so that we could be accurate in telling the story. So this piece of it, which we've tied in with the giants as well, is really important. And so, and this just gives you a lot of good background. There's some good visuals. There's some good links there that I definitely would check out if you haven't checked that out. And I'm from South Carolina, so I had a lot to learn about Michigan. I knew a lot about South Carolina's history, but I did learn a lot about Michigan. So this kind of walks you through some of the steps, but it also starts, and this is where it's also helpful, it starts with the geography of Michigan and just how we are so unique in our with the two peninsulas and the Great Lakes. And so that's just a background piece as well, but also it can be used as an enrichment piece. The Giants website is really valuable because it also provides, Phil has done a phenomenal job with just creating these clickable maps. I mean, these clickable maps are such a good visual for third graders. And then if you have the opportunity to get that floor map where kids can really gather around and really really use that. We use that for a variety of things. We use that to practice our cursive writing. When we write down what the name of the Great Lakes are, can we identify them, and just different pieces of the puzzle. And we follow Alexander Henry around and we ask the what and the why with that. So the Giants website also gives a lot of resources, and that's where a lot of these books are in there. That's constantly being updated. And so and that's also where you're going to find some stories about some of the true authentic Anishinaabe legend, but we also address the other parts with the French and the British. And so those are some good websites as well. And there's a lot of good activities that come out of there. So those are the two main resources that I have for you. And then there's another link later on to the names of those books that we mentioned, and the resources for that.
Great, thanks, Joy. So next we have two slides from Phil, and Phil, hopefully I've used your maps that you sent me. This is the most art I've did on the PowerPoints, but hopefully you see the maps you sent have been put to good use. So yeah, so if you want to talk about a couple of these things, that'd be great.
Yeah, I would just mention that the third grade Giants site includes hot links to a lot of these other sources, various archives. It links over to Minnesota one, to the St. Joseph Fort, to some museum sites around the state, and so on. The big clickable maps, you should just go up and look at them and explore. We have this little anecdote where a group of students in 3rd and 4th grade were supposed to show for 10 minutes to the school board what they'd been learning about it. And 25 minutes later, 4 of the groups were still going because the kids are that interested in opening this up and seeing these relationships. Like I say, I think those things will sell themselves to you if you just open them up and play around for a while. The Giants has got teacher notes and all these direct links. Central Michigan, the Michigan Geographic Alliance is putting up now some more activities to meet some of these standards. I don't bother to try to remember this URL at all. I just go out to Google and put Michigan Geographic Alliance down and click and go from there. So I don't know, do I have another frame right here? Just this one. Yeah, so that's his, go ahead.
Okay, so thank you so much. And Dr. Daley, you've offered quite a few links. I don't know if you have any in particular you'd like to discuss with the teachers who are watching.
I would really sort of urge looking at Michiganology. That is going to be from the State Archives of Michigan. And they put together a series of primary sources and materials for the pre-statehood era. And I would suggest that those are very good sources along the lines to work with. I guess I'm struck as I've been working with everyone, how sort of not very together the historians are. Everybody else has got good stuff and we don't. It's some things. The next one has an older site, Seeking Michigan, and there's a series of sort of links that go into both surveyor notes, Native American treaties as well. They also have primary sources that are pretty well structured, and the Michigan legislature has the text of all state constitutions. I know those aren't always produced. And I think there's one more slide, is there? Yeah, historical documents like the Northwest Ordinance, which are pretty straightforward. The link I mentioned earlier to Carolyn Kirkland, especially chapter 1. Settler letters from the Geddes family. Geddes family came very early, pre-statehood, 18 teens they showed up, so they're sort of interesting. And then for those of you who are sort of interested in this at all, the Michigan Pioneer Historical Collections, some of the introductions are dated. They're from the turn of the 20th century, but a huge number of primary sources are actually included within there. They're literally transcriptions of documents, so they're quite good. And I think there's one more. And then Hathitrust, that's Google Books. And in addition, Bentley Historical Library and the Digital Public Library of America has a number of primary source materials there. So that's very easily found for that material. But unfortunately for history, that has not yet been sort of put together in that sort of really good structure, but there's a lot of material that's available.
You think you're immune to that after watching everybody do it once. All right, so thank you so much, everybody. I was just saying that there are, our email addresses are listed. So if you have any questions about any of these things, we're all happy to answer any questions you have or provide you with some further resources and ideas for how you can take this to your classroom. I just want to offer a few things that I have done concerning state history and critically analyzing historical figures using the C3 framework. So the first one up here is a book chapter that I wrote with my colleague at Central Michigan University, Megan Block. She's actually an elementary expert, K through 5, English language arts. And she and I got together to come up with actually a Michigan lesson plan for this book about bringing more women into the Michigan standards, looking actually at county names and how county name or counties are named in honor of historic figures, and how we can actually bring an understanding of what this means for why and how we understand the study of women in history, and how we can use new ideas to learn more about women in our history textbooks and whatnot. Again, like I said, Michigan has some open-ended standards, so it's a lot easier in Michigan to bring in discussions of other people and groups than it may be in certain states. But again, this is just kind of a 6-step lesson plan about how to bring more women to your curriculum. Luckily, because that's a copyrighted book, but luckily we were asked to do a similar article for the Iowa Journal of Social Studies. And again, this is open access. So this 6-step lesson plan about using county names to understand more about bringing women into your curriculum is available for free, and you have the link here. So please, you can insert any person that you would like in this 6-step framework for using county names and to learn more about women in your state's history. So that's there for you. We've also, along with our colleague Steph Stration, we've come up with an idea or a framework for ways to evaluate historic figures in lower elementary social studies. And again, this is an open access journal, the Oregon Social Studies Journal. So again, if you go to this link, you'll find a 6-step lesson plan talking about a way to critically analyze or evaluate historic figures at a younger grade level. So again, these are all free and open for you to use as a source for lesson planning. Lastly, when I wrote these articles, I used the Michigan Women's Hall of Fame website. So basically, if you go to this website, it's an organization that honors important women in Michigan's history from statehood, pre-statehood all the way up to today. So I did find that website quite useful. So again, if you're looking to bring in different people and different groups into your curriculum, you may want to check out this website, and it would go well with the other 2 articles that I have provided. And again, my email is here as well. So if you have any questions about anything, please let me know. All right, Dave, I think we're back to you to close us out.
All right, let me just share my screen here quickly. But I want to thank everybody, thank all of our guests this evening and everyone who was here to learn from us tonight. This presentation will be up on the MCSS website, as well as the statewide Social Studies Collaborative website, misocialstudies.org. And while the webinar series is now over, which makes me kind of sad because this was, as Scott can tell you, our baby all year, or for the last few months, we encourage you to continue the conversation by tweeting at MCSS info or visiting our Facebook page. And you can join MCSS anytime, and you'll have access to professional development opportunities, publications, and other fun resources, all for $40 a year. So on behalf of our board, everyone listed here, I'd like to once again thank you all for coming and thank our guests for their phenomenal wealth of information this evening. And we all wish you a fantastic week and summer ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.